Hello, welcome to this part of the lecture. In this part, we're going to be talking about metadata and data sources. So we're going to be showing how we can create a metadata connection to different sources so we can leverage that as part of our data integration process. So as part of building the ETL jobs. Now, in covering that, we'll show how to get access to files, how to connect to databases, how to connect to APIs, FTP locations, SFTP locations, and you name it. Because if you think about it, in order to do data integration, we need to connect to sources or to destinations, so we can either pull data from the sources or put them into destinations. And how do you create that connection? Either to a source database or to a source file, so you can read that data. And then how do you create the connections to a destination database, destination API, FTP location, so we can write that data. Because companies, if you think about where data resides within companies, it's either a file, a database, some API, some FTP location. That's where the data exists, and so we should be able to create a metadata connection to those sources. Also, we're going to be spending some time talking about file processing. There is a lot of files out there. Believe it or not, companies still use a lot of files. I know, or you would know that, the world and the world of data processing is moving towards real-time processing with streaming type applications, real-time, near real-time, with streaming types of processing. But there are a lot of companies that still do things with files. So it could be an Excel file, it could be an XML file, it could be a JSON file. They're sending this file back and forth. And so we also have to be prepared as part of the ETL process to access files, ingest them, transform them, and be able to load them into destination database as part of the ETL process. So this part of the lecture would really dive into how we leverage Talend Open Studio to create metadata, access files, be able to process them, and we'll walk through some exercises step by step. So let's go ahead and switch over to Studio as part of this. Switch over to a Studio environment from where we left off from last time. As we come into Studio, when we talked about the layout of having the repository, the design canvas, the configurations tab, and the palette to the right, now assuming your boss comes to you and says, oh, we need to go to an Oracle database to pull data, or we need to go to MySQL database or a Teradata database in order to pull data, or Netezza, you name it, all the relational databases to pull data. In order to get access to that database, we need to create a connection first to the database. We need to somehow tell it what the database name is, what the username, the host name, and all the details, so that we can establish connection to that database before we begin reading data. If it's a file that's sitting on the desktop or sitting in some location, we also need to be able to establish connection to that file, define a schema around it so we can read that data. And within Studio, within Talend Open Studio, we perform all that metadata connections within the metadata tab. To be honest, this is one of the most versatile and highly used personally parts of the Studio environment, just because if you don't have connection to a data source or to a data you're trying to work with, you really cannot realistically pull that data or use it as a destination. So this is key. This is a place where you should spend quite a bit of time understanding it and being able to leverage it as part of the tool. So we'll walk through and explain each piece of this part of the tool so we can be familiar with it as well. The first piece that we have here is the database connection. Now, companies, I would say almost 90% of data you'll find within a company or within an organization reside in some form of a database. So the question is, how do we establish connections to a database? Within Studio, we come in here, the DB connections. This is where we create connections to the database. The example I'm going to walk through is I do have a MySQL database that sits on this machine. And I'm going to use that as an example to show us how we can establish connection to this. But realistically, you can use the same steps to apply it to any database that you have within your organization. And if it's not listed, I'm going to show you a way to do it, even if you don't have, if it's not available on the list that Talend provides. So we come in here, we can create a connection by right clicking, create connection, and that brings up a pop-up for us. As usual, it's the same format for the pop-up, so I'll give it a name. So MySQL demo connection. Of course, you want to give it a purpose, you want to give it a description, versioning, and all of the good stuff that you should provide when you're creating a connection, so that there's a lot of details around it. I'll skip those for now, and I'll click on next. Here from this drop down, this is what Talend offers out of the box, a list of, I would say, almost 99%, and this is subjective, of the databases that are available out there. So depending on what your organization is doing, or depending on what the project you're working on entails, you are simply selecting from the list of databases to select what you need. AS400, Access, Hive, Impala, Informix, JDBC, MySQL, Netezza, Oracle, the different versions of Oracle, Postgres, Redshift with AWS, Teradata, Vertica, and you name it. And you know, let's say you have some database that's so obscure that no one knows about it. More than likely, it's going to have a driver, maybe a JDBC driver, and you can use a generic JDBC driver to access some database that might not be listed here. More than likely, one of these databases will be what you're working with. But if you have something so obscure, the JDBC driver can always help you with getting access to it. As part of this exercise, I'm going to be working with MySQL, so we're going to go ahead and select MySQL. That's what I'm going to be working with. And it's so easy. All we need to do, select the versions. I'm going to keep it with the default version that we're working with, MySQL 5. And now we want to put in our login information. So depending on the database you're working with, we're going to go ahead and put in the login information for that, for the database. So we go ahead and we put in the information. Here I've put it, the information root. My password, this is localhost, just because I'm working from my localhost environment here. If you're working on a server or host on a network, you can put in the server name in there, the port, and the database name. So retailer DB, which is something that I have available within my MySQL environment over there. And that's all we need. So the next thing that we want to do is test the connection. So say, do we have connection to that database? So do we have connection to access that database and to actually work with it? And you can see my connection tested here as successful. Now all we need to do is click finish, and that gives us access to that database, which we can now begin to use within our jobs. So this is why we created MySQL demo connection. It's listed in here, but you can see below here there are no tables, right? Because if you're creating a connection to a database, so in this case MySQL, it could be SQL Server, it could be Oracle, it could be Hive, it could be Netezza, Vertica, Teradata, you name it. What we want to do is to be able to access the entities within that database. So we're talking about tables, we're talking about views, and all the different entities and constructs that exist within the database. And right now you can see I have table schemas, but there's nothing listed there, right? So the question is, how do we get access to that? So once you've established a connection to the database, the next step is to pull in the schema for that database. And Talend allows us to do is, you can click on the database, you select it, you right click on it, you can edit the connection, you can edit queries, you can delete it, you can make duplicates, of course. But what we want to do here is retrieve a schema. So what this does is it goes into the database itself, it pulls the schema of the tables that we need, and it makes it available for us within the studio environment, so that we can start reading data from a table, or we can write data to that table. So let's go ahead, click on retrieve schema. It comes up with the form, again, the same format. We can say we want to look at tables, we want to look at views and synonyms, depending on what you're pulling from your database. I don't care about views and synonyms in this case. I just want to look at database tables. Here we have the ability to put a filter, a wildcard filter. I'm going to leave everything blank so we can read everything that's available on the table. We click on next. Now you see the retailer DB. Remember when we define the database connection, we specify the database name on the database field. If you go back and watch the video, we had to specify retailer DB. So depending on the database that you specify, that becomes available here, and now you can see the tables within that database that you can begin to read and process. If I go back to MySQL, you can see my retailer DB has all these tables, right? So let's just take a look at the customer information here, customer table. So this is customers. It has some information, right? And it has the schema, everything within my SQL. If I switch over here, I have my customer table here. I have employees, I have offices, and everything that I need. So there might be situations where the company has thousands of tables within a database, and you could be required to pull all those tables, or you might want just a few tables for the integration that you're building. So this is really handy, where if I wanted just my customer and my offices and my orders information, I can select those, right? But if I wanted everything to pull in into my view here, so I can work with it, I can select everything. So you can select depending on what you're trying to do. It's really up to you with the sound judgment and the architecture pattern and what you're trying to accomplish. So in this case, I'm just going to select everything. Right now, the next thing that we need to do is view the schema of the database, so we can either make adjustments as needed. In this case, customer, we can select the customer table basically, and now we can see the columns that are being pulled from the customer table. So here we can see that we're bringing in the customer number, customer name, and everything all the way to the credit limit for this customer table, and we can see the data types. This is a data type that's defined within a database environment, and this is the data type that we're pulling out. So when you work with databases, you might realize that there might be times where the data type within the database might not be what you want to use in your ETL. So say Postgres, or say something like Snowflake, or some of the different databases that are out there, the varieties in the data types. In this case, I'll keep everything by default, but just have it at the back of your mind that sometimes you might have to change the data types to really match what you're trying to do, depending on the database that you're pulling from. This usually gets very picky, and a lot of the times when you have problems in your jobs, it's probably because the data types are having issues, conversions are having issues, or you're trying to join a string to an integer field later down the road and it doesn't work. So I would encourage you to really pay attention to your data types. In this case, I have an int and I have everything a string, and maybe a float there for my credit limit because it's an integer. It's a float, of course. So I wouldn't make a change, but you can verify every single one: offices, orders, payments, product lines, products. And so everything looks good. We can go ahead and click finish. Now, once we've clicked finish, we can see now within the table schema, we have the list of the tables that are available. And this is where we can now start using these tables in an ETL flow. I'm gonna go ahead and create a job to show us how we leverage that. Actually, before creating that, let's do one thing. Let's create a folder for that. So give it a name, metadata. In there, we're gonna create a job. MySQL read. Of course, give it a purpose and a description as the best practices allow. Now, what we want to do is we want to read this customer from this customer table and write it to the screen as we did before. Because I've retrieved the schema from here, all I need to do is click on this, as always, drag it to the screen, and this is intelligent enough to tell me that this is a MySQL database input. And I can simply select OK. If I was doing, say, Oracle, it would tell me it was Oracle. If I was doing Netezza, it would tell me it was Netezza. So in this case, MySQL, I just need to do OK, right? So it's telling me my customer information. And if I click on that particular component, select it, and go over to my component tab, below, I can see now that everything here is populated based on what we configured when we created this connection. It's pre-configured for me. And why is this important? Let me show you the difference. Because I created the connection here in metadata and pulled it to the screen, all my connection comes over. But if all I'd done was let's say if I went over here, because we have the same components that are available here, if I went over here, brought this to the screen, right? It's a database input. I can still select that I want it to be MySQL. Everything is listed here, the same, everything. Apply that. So that's a MySQL, of course. But guess what? Now I need to manually put in the host name, the database name, the username, and everything that's needed to establish this connection. Here, you can always do that, but the difference between that, and I'm going to talk about this in a later part of the lecture, is the difference between doing this and leveraging the customer approach is because this resides within the metadata repository. We call this a repository here. You can use this in multiple different jobs without having to manually configure it each time, right? So if I had to pull this into 10 different jobs, all I'm just doing is dragging that to the job, into the jobs, because I've already configured it. The configuration comes as well with it. But if I'm doing this, I'm bringing this directly to this particular job and configuring this. It still works, but guess what? If you have 10 jobs, 100 jobs, you're gonna have to set up this for the 100 different jobs that you're working with. So the key here is looking at the property type. This is built in, and if I go over here, so this, the one I just brought, if I go to this one, the property type here is repository. It means I'm pulling that information from the repository. And if I want to make a change to this, watch what happens. It tells me I'm going to be updating this repository, and if I update the repository, every job that is using this table would have to be updated because a change has been made. So again, don't worry too much about this. I'm going to cover this in another section that talks about repository built-in versus the repository connection, but it's something to have at the back of your mind. In which situations would you be creating built-in connections versus the repository connections? Here I'm going to focus on the repository connections, so I'm going to delete this, but just know there's another approach to accomplishing the same thing. So now that we've explained that and I've brought my customer information to the screen, I can then start reading that data and processing it as I want. So here I'm just going to log it as we've done previously. So read that data and log it to the screen. If we go ahead and we run this job, this should go to MySQL. It should read that data. It should log it to the screen. I can be doing some more complex transformations downstream if I wanted to, but this just gives us an idea where we're working in a company. There is data within the database. We want to get access to that data. We want to bring it into as part of the ETL process. We can access that data. Now, the next thing that I want to show as part of the metadata is not always will you be working with databases, right? There might be situations where you're working with a file. It could be a flat file, a CSV file, a tab delimited file, a positioner file, an XML file, a JSON file, you name it, because companies still work with a lot of files. And in that case, we're leveraging one of the different options that we have here. So if it's a delimited file, we're working here within the file delimited. If it's a XML file, we know JSON is becoming very popular. We can create those connections here. The process again for this is very simple. For working with files, I do have my data sets here. I do have retailer DB, customer CSV, and we'll go through the process of creating that. It's again very straightforward process. We do customer, let's go demo, which is a CSV. Give it a name, give it the description. So in this case, now I have to browse to a sample file that I'm trying to work with. So here I'll browse to my customer file, and this below here is a preview of the file that I'm working with. You can always check this to make sure that you're looking at the right file. I think it's always the best practice. Now the next thing that we want to do is we click next and we come into this tab. This is where we can fine-tune and configure the details of how to actually read the file we're working with. So let's take a look at some of the options that we're going to work with. In this case, we can change the encoding UTF-16, ISO, Windows Basic, and I'll always keep this as basic as possible. Here, what's the delimiter that the file is, this file that we're working with. Let's go ahead and actually open up that file so we can see what's in the file itself. So let's edit this with text editors like that. Open up, so we can see that this file, each column, and for those of us that are not familiar with what a file delimiter is, I would encourage you to go read about CSV files or file formats and such. But basically, a delimiter just simply separates the different columns within that file. So here, what we're saying that if you see a column, a comma, that's a new column, right? This could be a comma, this could be tab, this could be any figure that you want, any symbol that you want. So basically we have the first row being the header, the name of each column, and then we have the details that are below that. So that's what the CSV file really is. Now we have to define that here. So here we want to say, what are the field separators? So what separates each field? The default here is a semicolon, but we know that that file is not separated by a semicolon. We know it's a comma separated file. So we want to specify here that this is a comma. We can click on the drop down option and then go down, select comma. If it was a semicolon, we can select semicolon. If it was a tabulation, space, or any custom symbol, we can select that and we can put that symbol. So I'll do comma in that case. Row separator, we know it's next line. I wouldn't change that. That's what we had in the file. The next thing I want to do is I can select CSV here. It's almost redundant doing this and that, but I'll just do it in this case because we know the characters are CSV. The escape card is CSV. Now the next thing that we want to do is in the preview tab, we want to click on this setting here, set header row as column names. What this would do is it would tell the Talend when it's reading that file to take the first row which we saw earlier. Let me switch back to that. Actually, I have it over here. So what what we need is Talend to do is read this first row as the header, because this is not part of our data. So we want to take that, establish it as a header, and then the data starts from the second row here. So that's basically what this setting does. So it's very, very important. If your file, the first row, and most files do have that because you need to have a definition of what each column is. So they would always have this. So you want to set this, check that, so that it picks the first row as the heading column names. So let me go ahead and I can select that. If you notice, each time I select it, watch over to the top right. It's setting this here. So it's picking the header and it's saying the first row is the header. You can manually change this to whatever number that you want to pick it as a header. So maybe you have the file that the header row is like 5 lines down. You would change this to 5. So say pick that as the header row. But in most cases, it's usually the first row, and setting this should be enough. So now this is really the configurations that we have. We can limit the number of rows we want to read from this file. And so we do have some flexibility around that. Now that we have this, let's go ahead. You see my preview here was before I made all these changes. So now that we've made all the changes, let's refresh our preview so that we can see how the file now is actually read. So you can see things have changed a little bit. I do have my column names that are listed up there, and the file details. The details of the file is now listed below. And this is key, right? So we want to always verify this. We want to always eyeball this to make sure that everything looks great before we proceed. So it looks good. My customer number looks like what I expect. Let's go back over. Customer number is that. We have customer name. All of that looks like what we're gonna be expecting. So let's go ahead and click next. Now this brings us into the next piece. I can tell you how important this is because, again, like I said, 99% of the times once you start running into issues as you're building workflows would somehow result around the data type. Maybe you have the wrong data type and you're trying to convert a string to an integer or something. It's gonna be throwing you off, and that's where you're gonna spend the bulk of your time debugging. So just always pay attention to make sure that the data types that you've seen here matches what you expect of that data. I think Talend does a good job of inferring the data type for you, and the way it does it is, I think it previews about the top 50 records. It looks at the top 50 records of this file, and then it infers the data type. So if it looks at this, it says, oh, it's an integer. It looks at this and the top 50 and says, oh, this is a string. Now, what if you had a situation where you had some integers here and then below you had strings because of an error or something, and then that gets missed? Right? It's really up to you to come in here and double check to say, yeah, I actually want this to be an integer and I want this to be a string. If that's not what you want, then you can see this is a string, right? Let's look at credit limit. Somehow credit limit, if you see this, these are all I wouldn't pick this as strings. These are all doubles at the very least, or floats. but somehow it's picking this as a string. Unless you really want that to be a string, if I didn't want it to be a string, I'll go ahead and I'll change that. So I'll go ahead, change it to, you know, what you expect it to be. So if you wanted it to be a double, make sure you make it into a double, right? So always pay attention to this. Again, like I said, this is something that would throw people off very, very, very much. Now let's finish that. And there you have it. I have my customer demo file now established. In my metadata, I can see the columns that I'm pulling, and I can start using this within my job. So let's go here in our metadata, create another job to show us how we can leverage that. So give it a name, customer file. As before with the database, all we need to do is select the connection that we created, bring it over to the screen. Again, Talend is smart enough to tell us, you know, that this is a file input delimited. Before, when we did it as MySQL, it told us that was a MySQL. If it was Oracle, it would tell us. So there's a little bit of an intelligent view here that tells you the component. You can always change it depending on what you're doing, but in this case, it's right. Most of the time, it tells you what you need, and you just need to click OK. So here we're clicking OK, customer demo. We're gonna write that to the screen. So let's connect the component as before. Let's connect that. Let's clear this, and then we run the job as before. Now we have it all written to the screen. Actually, let me format this just so we get it good. So I'm gonna select that component, format it as a table. When you want to configure the properties here, always make sure you have the right component selected. So I have the component selected. I configure it as a table view. So we run it. I just want it so that the formatting looks good. So it's a better formatting. So this is what we have in the file, and this is a very easy process, a very easy step that shows us you will have a file. Depending on the delimiter of that file, you can always create a connection to that file and then leverage that connection within your Talend job. Now, if I was trying to write this file to a table, all I need to do is simply replace this output here with a connection to the database, and I can start reading files and writing them to databases. That is ETL, right? We're extracting data. Maybe we do some transformations, and then we can load that data to a destination. Now that we've seen a simple file, one other thing that is very popular is working with files like XML or working with files like JSON. This is, you know, you might find situation where you're not just working with the CSV file like we did here. You might be working with an XML file, or you might be working with a JSON file. And I do have some examples here in my data set. So I do have some JSON files in there. I do have some XML files. I'm gonna go ahead and show this example for JSON, but more than likely, you know, you can just apply the same thing if you had an XML file or if you had some other file that you're working with. So in this case, we're simply coming down a little bit to the screen here. And what we want to do is go to the JSON environment. As always, we right click. Actually, the file name is roots. So let's do fruits JSON. Give it a description. So when we're working with JSON, unlike the way we work with file delimited, is we can specify, is this JSON file going to be an input file? Are we going to be reading data from that file for input, or are we going to be writing data into this file as an output? So in this case, depending on what you're trying to do, you want to make sure you have the right connection set up here, selection picked up here. So because I'm doing an input, I'm going to be reading from a JSON file. I have a file on my desktop, which I just showed a little bit earlier. I have this JSON file. Let's actually take a look at that file. Open that with text editor. So I do have this file that is sitting on my desktop. It should open up somewhere here, I believe. Oh, there you go. So I do have a file, simple, not a lot of records. You can see JSON format in here. I do have my label fruit, and the value is apple, size large, color red. So I want to be able to parse this so it's flattened out, so I can be able to write this to a database, or I could write this to some other system. So we select input JSON, And there are different ways to read JSON files. I'll let you read up on this. There is the X path, there is a JSON path. These are formats in which you can actually drill down into the JSON to pull in the values and the attributes that you need. So I'll keep this by default, the JSON path. But depending on which one you're familiar with, XPath or JSON path, you can use them. If you're not familiar with those, please spend some time, go on YouTube, go on other places, read up about JSON path and XPath. They are pretty popular out there and a little bit beyond the scope of this video. So check those out, but I'll leave the default that we have. Now, as always, I'm gonna browse to my file to get a sample of the file that I'm gonna be processing. So we wanna go back here to dataset, JSON. Let's pick the first file as an example. Now you see it's pull out the attributes, the schema viewer below. It tells me the schema of the file as the examples. So I can, you know, take a look at the attributes that are coming within the file. And now click next. We want to be able to go in and pull out the attribute. This is a very simple, anyone who's worked with JSON know the example I'm giving here is very simple. But you can apply this to more complex scenarios depending on what you have. So you might have nested JSON files that are a little bit more complex. Then you have to do a little bit more, your parsing might be a little bit more different than I'm doing here, but this should give you an idea of what happens. So here I want to just loop on the root element. So that's the looping path, and then I want to pull in all these attributes. So these are the fields that I want to extract. So if you think about JSON, you have a looping element, and then you have the fields that you want to pull out. So if we refresh a preview, this should show me the sample values that I'm going to be pulling. So if you notice, now it's pulled out the attributes correctly, and the names of my schema, it looks good. So I can go ahead, click next. This is my metadata. The type is all string. Again, the process of inferring the type based on the top 50 records. So it looks at the file, it pulls the top 50 records, it profiles those, and then it infers, it guesses what your data type would be. So we want to always check to make sure that the data type here is correct. So I'm expecting a string, string, all looks good. My length doesn't really matter in this case. So I can go ahead and can click finish. Now that I have finished, I have that connection available here, and I can leverage it within my job. So let's go ahead, create a new job. Give it a name, fruit JSON. And so once you have a connection, all we need to do in this case is pull that connection to the screen. Again, it's smart enough. It tells us that this is a JSON input. We click OK on that, and we log it to the screen with a T-log row. I could be putting that to a database. I could be writing that to another file. I could be putting that to a web service, but that's beyond the scope. Once you have this, it's a very simple job. If I run that, we should see the record splashed out to the screen, flatten out, so that we can, you know, either use this, put this to a database, join it with other JSON documents, and be able to process that. You can go ahead, do the same for an XML document. If you had an XML document, follow through, create connection to the XML document, and that's how you can read XML documents. So I think this gives us a good idea. More than likely, you're working within an organization, 99% of your data will be coming in as databases or files, right? XML documents, JSON, you know, files, Excel, you name it, or positional files as well. I tend to see that sometimes. So you can always leverage the connections here to create that connection, and then once you have the connection, you can use it within your job. Now the next thing is, we're seeing a lot of or you might be familiar with a lot of, you know, SaaS applications in the cloud, things like Azure storage, right, or Google Drive. You want to pull data from there, or Salesforce CRM, or Snowflake, right, the data warehouse in the cloud. You might want to be able to create a connection there so you can read tables from Snowflake or write to Snowflake environment. All you need to do is follow the same steps, give it a name. In this case, we can say Snowflake, depending if you have a Snowflake account. Give it a name, your account information, user ID, password, select your region, right? So in this case, this is AWS, and Talend also supports Azure. So if you're having Snowflake on Azure, which I think it just came out very recently, the last 5 or 6 months, depending on when you're watching this video. 2018, depending on again when you're watching this video. Snowflake was before, it was just on AWS, and then it went on Azure as well. So depending on the region, you can select that, put in your information, and you can establish connection to your Snowflake environment, from which you can begin to read data or write data. And then the data might be coming from web services, FTP locations. You can also create connections to that. Now, one thing that I want to show, and let's just take a quick refresher here, switching back, is we're talking about creating metadata and working with files. Then we've established how we can create metadata to databases, files, FTP, APIs, and then being able to work with files, JSON, XML, Excel documents. We can all do that. But let's really drill down on what it means, a metadata, and why that is very powerful and versatile, and something that you can really have up your sleeves to use. So let's work with this. Let's look at the customer. So if we since we created the connection to the customer information, below you see here what we call the metadata. The metadata is, in this case, is data about data. So this is what tells us that the customer information has this amount of columns, the data types, and all the stuff that describes the data. So this is not the actual data itself, but it's just data about data. But there might be situations where we want to take the schema, this metadata, and now you hear me calling this the schema, and apply it to a different data source. So say we're going to be pulling in from another data source, and we want to get all these column names and lists. How do we easily copy that and apply it there? So what Talend also offers is what we call a generic schema. So you can define a generic schema and then use that within your job. I'm going to go ahead and do that so we can get an idea. So let's go in here, create a generic schema. Let's say person. This is a schema. Think about it. This is a generic description of what a person is. In this case, I'll give it a name. I'll say person should have a first name. Person should have last name. And the person should have maybe an email address. So this is all generic. We want to make sure the data type is good, and we have access to that generic schema. So we're defining the schema here. So let's go ahead, click OK. Now that my schema is defined, person, if I just try to take this into a job, it doesn't really make sense. It does, unlike the other components above here, where it actually refers to something. This is just a generic schema, so I can't really just pull this to the screen and do anything with it. Now the way I can use this is, let's go ahead, create a new job here, give it a name, call it generic schema. So once the job opens, let's go into files. Let's assume that was coming from a file. We bring in a file input delimited. Let's say we wanted to do all this manually, so we bring in the file input delimited, and then we select that component, of course, and we configure the component. Each time you bring something, you always configure it so it looks good. So I'm just gonna keep this generic here. The point is to focus on the schema. So if you notice, if I edit the schema, it's blank. There's nothing here, because I don't have a schema defined to it. Like I don't have something telling the column names that should be available here. I can now go in manually and try to create this, right, and add the names here. But imagine that you had a lot of jobs, or hundreds of thousands of jobs, and you had to do this for all your jobs. Excuse me for clicking that. And you had to do this for all your jobs. It could be very time consuming to be defining the schema here. So what I'll do in this case is I'll go ahead, go back to my generic schema. Let's say someone had already defined this generic schema. I can click on that schema, open it up, right? I can select the fields. So just clicking shift and making sure I'm clicking below, selecting all the fields. Here I can copy the selected items. So copy selected items. Now once those are copied, if I go back to my component, here I edit schema, I come in here, you will notice there is a paste icon here. I can paste that. So there you have it. So this is, again, it looks simple just because we have 3 columns, but imagine having a table with 50 or 100 or 200 or 400 columns. Believe me, I've seen that, right? And you have to manually type all of this. That could be time consuming and very painful to do. But with the generic schema, you can define it once, and each time you need to use it in your job, you're simply just copying that and bringing it over, and it's very straightforward to do. So now that I have a schema applied to this, I can use it within my job. Another approach of, instead of copying that, is I can always change this from a built-in. Remember we talked about built-in schema before. I think you can watch some of the previous videos on where that was covered, versus a repository schema. I can, instead of having this as a built-in, it's built-in because I just brought this to this particular component, I can change that to a repository schema, and that allows me to browse the repository, and I can go into generic schema and actually take the schema from here. So that's another approach. So instead of copying and pasting, I can use this approach to get the schema that way. So if I click on view schema, it would be the schema that was defined in the repository, right? But the difference with this is, because I'm pulling it from the repository, I cannot make a change here. But you can do that for the first time, then change it back to a built-in, and everything will stay within your job. So let me do that again. So I'll go ahead, delete everything. So right now I don't have a schema, but I need this person's schema to be applied to this file so that I can pull it in. So what I can do is I can switch that to repository, right? Person. Now if I edit that, it's pulling the person's schema, and I have it in there, right? But if I really don't want to keep this in the repository, I can change it back to a built-in, but that schema still stays, and I can add more if I wanted to. Remember, you cannot edit repository schemas from within your jobs unless you go to the repository and edit that. So I can say I can add age, for example, if I wanted to here, and now I would have that available for me to use. So that's really how that's something that you want to pay attention to and really be familiar with in terms of the different types of schema, what a built-in schema is versus what a repository schema is. And you can do the same for the properties. So you can also use built-in properties, or you can use repository properties. So here I do have a built-in. I can change this to a repository, and it can tell me what repository property I want to use. I can say, hey, let's read the customer demo properties. Notice it goes into that predefined connection. It pulls the values from there, and it makes it available to this job. So you really have that flexibility, and it's key to understand the difference between a built-in versus repository, whether you're working with just the regular property type or you're working with schema. And the way I use this is, best practice, always define it here in the repository, in the metadata, and then pull it into your job and then reference the repository ones. If you're just doing it built in, then it's only applied to this particular job and this particular component, meaning if you have a different job, you have to do that again. But if you had it defined here, you can always just reference it from your repository. So something to pay attention to that really is key. Last but not least, web services. As I mentioned, you can create WSDL schemas here and connect to different web services. That's becoming really popular as well. But this, in general, metadata is a very versatile part of the tool, and something that you should really be familiar with and get comfortable, so that if there's any data source that you want to get access to, this is where you want to start establishing that connection. And once you have the connection, you can use it in your job. A lot of these components will not work if you don't have connections to tell it where to read data or to write data. And by establishing that connection here, you can configure these individual components to actually make it work. So let's switch back over to recap of what we've talked about in this part of the lecture, where we're creating metadata connections to different data sources, files, databases, APIs, FTP locations, which is basically file transfer protocol locations, SFTP, and you name it. We've also talked about JSON, JavaScript object notation. It's very popular. A lot of companies these days are moving files in this format. If you're not familiar with JSON, just make sure you watch a YouTube video, Google it, and be very familiar with it. It's becoming very popular. XML as well. XML had been in the past way before JSON. It's another very popular format. A lot of files will be coming in, a lot of data coming in as XML, and you want to have the competency to be able to access that data, ingest it, transform it into a database. We also have the regular Excel and CSV files, tab files, positioner files, and the whole 9 yards of different files that are available out there. So this is a recap of this part of the lecture, metadata, and working with different data sources. In the next lecture, we're going to dive into joins. So how do we join data from different data sources, pull them together, cache for errors, and be able to do lookups for more complex scenarios. So stay tuned for that.